3 lawyers in matching charcoal suits rose to their feet when I walked into that courtroom, and the one in the middle, the expensive one, the one my former in-laws had flown in from Chicago, actually gave me a small nod, the kind you give an opponent you've already beaten and can afford to be gracious to. Behind them sat my ex-husband, relaxed, one ankle crossed over his knee. Beside him sat his mother, chin up, in the good pearls she saved for occasions. And in my hand, the only weapon I had brought into the fight for custody of my 7-year-old daughter was a single unopened envelope. I watched the lead attorney's eyes drop to that envelope, register it as nothing, and move on. I watched all 3 of them settle back into the easy confidence of people who have a mountain of paperwork, a fortune behind them, and a story they're certain the judge will believe. They had prepared for months. They had spent, I would later learn, more on legal fees than I made in 2 years, and they were about to lose all of it, because of one thing they had never thought to ask about. One small, quiet fact that my daughter, without knowing it, had handed me at a swimming pool 11 weeks earlier. But let me back up. Because the story of how a 34-year-old Army nurse ended up walking alone into a custody battle against 3 of the best lawyers money could buy doesn't start in that courtroom. It starts with a little girl, a pair of pink goggles, and a sentence so small I almost didn't hear it. My name is Nora Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a captain in the United States Army, a critical care nurse. My whole professional life is spent noticing small things before they become emergencies. The slight change in a monitor's rhythm, the number that drifts a point out of range, the patient who says they're fine in a voice that means they aren't. In an ICU, the difference between a good night and a catastrophe is almost always something small that somebody caught early. I have spent a decade training myself to catch the small thing. That training, it turned out, was the only reason I got to keep my daughter. Her name is Maddie, and she was 7 that spring, a watchful, quiet kid, the kind who sits at the edge of a loud room taking it all in and then, days later, repeats back something you didn't even know she'd heard. Her teachers always wrote the same word on her reports: perceptive. I used to think that was a gentle way of saying shy. I know better now. Maddie's father, Grant, and I married young, before my second posting, and we divorced when she was 4. For a while it was as amicable as those things get. We shared custody. Maddie lived with me most of the time and spent every other weekend and half her holidays with Grant. It functioned. Then 2 things changed, close together, and everything came apart. The first thing was money, Grant's, specifically. His parents, Richard and Colette Ashford, were wealthy in the old, quiet way, the kind of family with a name on a hospital wing. Grant had always been the disappointment, the son who couldn't hold a career, and for years his parents had kept him at arm's length. But when Maddie came along, something shifted in them. Not toward Grant, toward Maddie. She was the only grandchild, and Colette Ashford, I came to understand, had decided that the Ashford granddaughter was going to be raised as an Ashford, in the Ashford house, with the Ashford money, and that a divorced Army nurse, who moved every few years for her postings, was an obstacle to be removed. The second thing was my career. I received orders for a training rotation, a demanding one, 3 months at a facility 2 states away, the kind of assignment that advances a nurse toward the roles she spent a decade working for. It was temporary. Maddie would stay in her school, in her home, with the arrangement I'd carefully built, my sister moving in to help, Grant taking his normal weekends, everything documented and stable. Thousands of military parents do exactly this. It is ordinary. The Ashfords saw it as their opening. I didn't understand how deliberately at first. I noticed things. The way Colette suddenly appeared at every custody exchange, always warm with Maddie, always with that enormous leather handbag. The way Grant grew cool and started using phrases that didn't sound like him, phrases like stable home environment and consistency for the child. I noticed Maddie came back from their weekends quieter, and once, tearful, saying Grandma had told her that Mommy's job was more important to Mommy than Maddie was. I addressed that one directly, gently, and I filed it away. But I told myself the rest was ordinary friction. Grandparents get involved. Exes get territorial. I explained it all away, because the alternative, that a family with limitless resources was methodically building a case to take my child, was too big and too frightening to look at head-on. Then came the pool. It was a Saturday, a community pool day, one of those shared custody afternoons where both households end up at the same place because it's Maddie's swim lesson, and neither parent wants to miss it. Grant was there. Colette was there, under a wide hat, holding court by the loungers. I was watching Maddie kick across the shallow end in her pink goggles, and when the lesson ended she came running to me, dripping, thrilled, and threw her wet arms around my waist. And then, in that unfiltered way children have of reporting the most consequential things as afterthoughts, she said, "Mommy, Grandma took me to a special doctor. She said it's a secret. I had to answer lots of questions about you." I kept my face perfectly still. 10 years in critical care teaches you to keep your face still while your insides go cold. That sounds interesting, baby. What kind of questions? Like if you ever yell, and if I'm scared at your house, and if you leave me alone. Maddie frowned, working to be accurate, because she is a child who cares about being accurate. I said you don't leave me alone, and Grandma said to think harder. But I couldn't think of any times, Mommy, because there aren't any. She looked up at me, suddenly uncertain. Did I do it wrong? No, sweetheart, I said, and I crouched down and looked her right in the eyes. You did it exactly right. You told the truth. You always tell the truth, okay? No matter who asks. She nodded, satisfied, and ran off to get her towel. And I stood there by the shallow end of a public pool with the sun on my back, and understood that the ground had just shifted under my entire life. Because there is only one reason a grandmother takes a child to a special doctor in secret and coaches her to think harder about whether her mother is frightening or negligent. They were building a psychological narrative. Someone, a hired evaluator, was being fed a story that Maddie was frightened and neglected in my care, and they'd tried to use my own daughter as the source, and they'd sworn her to secrecy about it. I did not make a scene at that pool. Every cell in my body wanted to walk over to Colette Ashford under her wide hat and put an end to it right there. But I have spent my career learning that in a crisis, the person who reacts loudest is rarely the person who wins. You stabilize first, you gather information, you do not tip your hand before you understand the full picture. So I smiled, and I toweled off my daughter, and I told her again how proud I was that she'd told the truth, and I drove us home with my hands steady on the wheel, and my mind moving at a speed I hadn't felt since my last mass casualty rotation. That night, after Maddie was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table and did what I do when a patient is crashing, and I need to think clearly. I made a list. Everything I'd noticed over the previous months, laid out in order, stripped of the excuses I'd been making. Colette at every exchange, Grant's borrowed vocabulary, Maddie's quietness, the comment about my job, and now, a secret evaluation, a coached child, an interview designed to manufacture fear that didn't exist. Laid out like that, in order, it stopped being friction. It was a campaign, and I had just been given the single warning I was going to get, not by a lawyer, not by a court filing, but by a 7-year-old in pink goggles who was proud of herself for telling the truth. 11 days later, the campaign came out into the open. I was served. Grant, backed, the filing made unmistakably clear, by his parents' money, was petitioning for full physical and legal custody of Maddie, and the grounds took the air out of my lungs. The petition described me as an unstable, largely absent mother whose military career made me incapable of providing a stable home. It cited my upcoming training rotation as abandonment. It referenced concerning behavioral indicators observed in the child, and attached to it was a preliminary letter from a psychologist, a child custody evaluator, noting that the minor child had presented with anxiety related to the maternal home environment. The secret doctor. They'd taken my daughter to an evaluator, fed her leading questions, and turned her honest, confused answers into a document that made me sound dangerous. I sat with that petition for a long time. I'll be honest about the two things I felt, because both matter. The first was terror, the specific, animal terror of a parent reading a stranger's plan to take her child. It's a fear that lives in your body, not your head. The second thing, rising slowly underneath the fear, was something steadier and colder and more useful. Because the Ashfords had made a mistake. In their certainty, they'd shown me their entire strategy before I ever walked into a courtroom. And thanks to Maddie, I'd known it was coming for 11 weeks. The next morning I made 2 calls. The first was to my sister Kate, who lived 20 minutes away and had already agreed to move in during my rotation. I told her everything. There was a silence, and then Kate, who was not a crier, said in a thick voice, "They tried to use Maddie against you. They put that on a baby." And then steadier, "Okay, what do you need? I'm not going anywhere. I'll testify, I'll move in tomorrow, I'll do whatever. Tell me the plan." "I need you to be exactly what you are," I said. "Steady, present. Because they're going to say I don't have a stable home, and you living there, loving her, is the answer to that." The second call was to a family law attorney, a woman named Frances Delgado, recommended through the Legal Assistance Office on Post, a resource I'd never once used in a decade of service. Her office was small and cluttered, files stacked on every surface, a coffee maker that had clearly outlived several presidencies. She was maybe 60, silver-haired, unhurried in a way that made the ground feel solid for the first time since the pool. She read every page of the petition without saying a word. Then she took off her reading glasses and set them down. "Captain Bennett, I've done family law for 31 years, and I'm going to tell you 2 things. The first is that this petition is built to overwhelm you. 3 attorneys, a wealthy family, a psychologist's letter, and a mountain of paper. It's designed to make you feel like you've already lost, so that you'll settle, or panic, or make a mistake. That's the strategy. Intimidation. And I want you to understand that people reach for intimidation when they don't actually have the facts. And the second thing?" She tapped the psychologist's letter. "The second thing is that this is not their strongest evidence. It's their biggest vulnerability, because a custody evaluation only carries weight if it was conducted properly. And an evaluation where one party takes a child in secret, without the other parent's knowledge or consent, and coaches her with leading questions?" Frances's eyes sharpened. "That's not evidence, Captain. That's misconduct. If we can prove how this was obtained, it doesn't just get thrown out. It detonates their entire case, because it shows the court exactly what kind of people we're dealing with." I told her about the pool, about what Maddie had said, freely, unprompted, and Frances, who was scrupulous about the ethics of involving a child, asked me only careful questions. Had I coached Maddie? Had I pressured her? Had I recorded her? I hadn't. Maddie had told me on her own, and I'd done nothing but tell her she'd done right by being honest. Frances nodded slowly. "Then here's what we do," she said. "We are not going to fight their psychologist's letter by arguing with it. Arguing looks like excuses. We are going to find out exactly how that evaluation was conducted, who arranged it, who was present, what the child was asked, and whether both legal guardians consented. Because I promise you, Captain, people who cut corners always leave a trail. They can't help it. And when we pull that trail into the light, the family that brought 3 lawyers to take your daughter is going to wish they'd never filed." over the next 11 weeks, because that's how long these things take, no matter what television tells you. I did what I do best. I noticed the small things, and I gathered them. Frances was relentless about the rules. I was not to investigate the Ashfords directly, not to contact their evaluator, not to do a single thing that crossed a line. Because in a custody case, the one thing you cannot afford is to look like the parent who behaves badly. We win this clean, she said, or we hand them the weapon they don't currently have. So we worked with what was legitimately ours, and with what the court could compel through discovery. And it turned out there was a great deal we could pull into the light. Frances filed a formal demand for the complete file behind that psychologist's letter, the full evaluation, the intake records, the consent forms, the notes, the list of who was present. At first, the Ashfords' 3 lawyers did exactly what Frances predicted. They objected, they delayed, they produced the polished summary letter but not the underlying file. Frances just kept filing, patient and relentless, and she told me that resistance this fierce almost always means there's something underneath worth hiding. She was right. When the underlying records finally came, they told a very different story than the tidy letter had. The evaluation had been arranged and paid for entirely by Colette Ashford. The consent form had been signed by Grant alone. I, Maddie's primary custodial parent, had never been notified, never consented, never even known it was happening, which for an evaluation meant to inform a custody decision was a serious procedural failure. The intake notes recorded that the child was brought in by her grandmother, not a parent. And the evaluator's own session notes, because a professional documents everything, including the things that later look bad, recorded that the grandmother had been present in the room during portions of the child interview, and had, on more than one occasion, prompted the child and expressed dissatisfaction with her answers. There it was, in the evaluator's own handwriting. Maddie had told them, again and again, that she wasn't afraid at my house, that I didn't leave her alone, that she was happy with Mommy, and each time, according to the notes, Colette had pushed her to reconsider. The anxiety in that letter, the concerning behavioral indicators, wasn't Maddie's fear of me. It was a 7-year-old's distress at being pressured by her grandmother to say something she knew wasn't true. But the notes held one more thing, and it was the piece that changed everything. The evaluator, uneasy enough to protect herself, had documented a remark Colette made near the end of the process. The substance of it, and I'm describing it, not quoting a document I shouldn't reproduce, was that the grandmother had said the family simply needed enough on paper to shift custody, because, in her words, the Ashford granddaughter belonged with the Ashfords, and a woman who dragged the child from base to base was never going to be the one to raise her. It had nothing to do with Maddie's safety. It had nothing to do with my fitness as a mother. It was a wealthy family deciding they were entitled to a child and manufacturing the paperwork to take her. I sat in Frances's cluttered office when she showed me that page, and I did not feel rage, though I had earned the right to it. What I felt was the cold, clean clarity I feel when a chaotic emergency finally resolves into a problem I know how to solve. Because I understood the whole shape of it now, and I understood something else. They had no idea I knew any of this. As far as their 3 lawyers were concerned, I was still the overwhelmed, outmatched single mother who would walk into that courtroom alone and fold. There was one detail in those notes that I keep coming back to, even now. Near the end of the record, the evaluator had written down something Maddie said. A small thing, an aside, the kind of thing a child says without knowing it matters. When the grandmother pressed her, one final time, to say she was afraid at Mommy's house, Maddie had apparently looked at the evaluator and said, "My mommy takes care of sick people so they don't die. She's not scary, she's a hero." And the grandmother, according to the notes, had told her to stop being dramatic. I read that line 3 times in Frances's office. My daughter, 7 years old, cornered in a stranger's room, pressured by an adult she loved and trusted to betray her own mother, and she'd held the line. She'd told the truth even when telling the truth was hard, even when the person pushing her was her grandmother. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake wondering whether my career, my absences, my postings had cost her something, whether I'd failed her by being the kind of mother who wears a uniform and leaves. And here was my answer, in a court evaluator's notes. My little girl thought I was a hero, and she'd defended me to a room full of adults who wanted her to say otherwise. Frances watched my face and said quietly, "That's the whole case right there. Not the misconduct, not the motive. That, a child who wouldn't lie about her mother, no matter how hard they pushed." She let me sit with it for a moment. Then she got back to work because that's what good lawyers do. Frances took the single most important document, the evaluator's own session file, the one that showed the coaching and recorded Colette's true motive, and she slid it into a plain white envelope. "On the day of the hearing," she said, "I want you to carry this in, and nothing else. No briefcase, no stack of folders, one envelope. Let them see it. Let them not know what it is. Let them wonder. A small, dry smile. People who believe they've already won stop asking questions. And people who stop asking questions don't find out what's in the envelope until it's far too late." The 11 weeks before the hearing were the hardest of my life, and I won't pretend otherwise. I had to leave for part of my training rotation. I couldn't abandon it without handing the Ashfords the abandonment narrative on a plate. So I went, and Kate moved in exactly as planned, and I flew back for every hearing date and every weekend I could. Living apart from Maddie during that stretch, knowing what her grandmother was trying to do, was a specific kind of agony I hope you never know. I'd call every night. Kate would put Maddie on, and my daughter would tell me about her day, and I'd lie in a bunk 2 states away and hold the phone and breathe. There were nights the fear nearly won, nights I thought about surrendering, about withdrawing from the rotation, killing my career, giving the Ashfords whatever they wanted, just to make the threat go away. I said as much to Frances once, on the phone, my voice cracking, and Frances said something I've never forgotten. "Captain, if you throw away your career to prove you're a good mother, all you've done is prove their point, that your career and your child can't coexist. Don't fight their lie by living it. Fight it by winning." Then softer, "You catch small problems before they become catastrophes for a living. You've already caught this one. Now let me do my job, and you keep being exactly the mother you are." And there was Kate, who held the center of Maddie's world while I was away, who sent me photos every day. Maddie at breakfast, Maddie's lost tooth, Maddie asleep with the light on, so that I never missed a single ordinary miracle of my daughter's life. "She's okay," Kate would text. "She's happy. She misses you, but she's okay. You're going to win this, and you're going to come home." I read those texts 100 times each. One night about 3 weeks before the hearing, Kate called instead of texting, and her voice was careful in a way that made my stomach drop before she'd said a word. She told me that Colette had shown up unannounced at Maddie's school that afternoon, during pickup, and tried to take her for a special treat. No notice, no arrangement, outside any custody time. The school, thank God, had a note on file that only Kate and I were authorized for pickup that week, and they'd held firm, and Colette had made a scene in the parking lot before leaving. Maddie had watched the whole thing from the office window. I stood in a stairwell 2 states away, gripping the phone, and I felt the fear try to take me under. Because this was the thing I couldn't be there for. This was my daughter, frightened, watching adults fight over her, and I was hundreds of miles away in a uniform. But then Kate said, "Nora, listen, when I picked her up, you know what Maddie said to me? She said, 'Grandma's not allowed to just take me. Mommy has rules to keep me safe.'" Kate's voice broke a little. "She's not scared, Nora. She feels protected. Whatever you and that lawyer are doing, it's working. She knows somebody's got a wall around her. I called Frances that night and told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Document it. The school incident, the date, the witnesses. Add it to the pile." A pause. "And Captain, a grandmother who tries to grab a child out of school in the middle of a custody dispute is not a woman who's going to look good in front of a judge. She's coming apart. People who are certain they've won don't ambush a first grader at pickup. Let her keep making our case for us." I hung up and sat on the edge of the bunk for a long time. The fear was still there. It never fully left, not once in those 11 weeks. But underneath it now was something I could stand on. My daughter felt safe. My sister was a wall. My lawyer was patient and relentless. And the other side was starting to panic. In an ICU, you learn to read the moment a crashing situation turns the corner toward stable. It's not dramatic. It's just a number that stops falling and holds. That night, 2 states from my daughter, I felt the number hold. The one thing I never did was make Maddie carry any of it. Frances and I were united on that, completely. A child is never a soldier in her parents' war. Maddie never sat in a lawyer's office. She never testified. She never knew there was a courtroom. As far as my daughter understood, Mommy was away for work and Aunt Kate was staying over, and everything was normal. Because I would have burned my career to the ground before I let the Ashfords do to her in my custody what they'd done to her at that secret doctor. The hearing was set for a Wednesday morning at the county courthouse. Kate drove me. I asked her to keep Maddie at home, far from that room. I wanted my daughter nowhere near it. I wore a simple navy suit, on Frances's advice. "You're not walking in as a soldier asking for the court's sympathy," she'd said. "You're walking in as a mother who has the truth in her hand. Dress like it, and in that hand one white envelope. I will never forget walking through those doors. The 3 attorneys in their matching charcoal suits, rising like a wall. Grant behind them, relaxed, checking his watch. Colette in her pearls, chin high, radiating the certainty of a woman who had never once in her life failed to buy the outcome she wanted. And the lead lawyer's small, gracious, victorious nod when he saw me come in alone. His eyes flicked to the envelope in my hand and dismissed it, and he turned back to his colleagues. Frances was already seated. She patted the chair beside her. "Steady," she murmured. "Let them run their whole play first. The longer they perform, the further they have to fall." And run it they did. For the better part of an hour, the lead attorney built the Ashford case, and he was very, very good. He described a devoted father and a stable, loving extended family, with resources and a beautiful home and every advantage a child could want. He described me, in that smooth, regretful courtroom voice, as a mother whose demanding career and constant relocations made a stable childhood impossible. A woman who was, at that very moment, living 2 states away from her own daughter. He put the psychologist's summary letter on a screen. He read the phrase concerning behavioral indicators aloud, slowly, letting it land. He used the word instability the way a carpenter uses a hammer. When he finished, he looked genuinely, completely confident. He had no idea what was in the envelope. Then it was Frances's turn, and she did not raise her voice a single time. She stood, and she walked to the front of the room, and she began, calmly, to take the whole thing apart. She started with the psychologist's letter. "Counsel has placed great weight on this evaluation," she said, "so I'd like to ask about how it was conducted." She turned to the Ashfords' lead attorney. "Can you confirm for the court whether Captain Bennett, the child's primary custodial parent, consented to this evaluation, or was even informed it was taking place?" A pause, the first crack. The lead attorney said something about the father's consent being sufficient. Frances nodded pleasantly, as if he'd been helpful. "And can you confirm," she continued, "who brought the child to these sessions?" Another pause, longer. And in that silence I watched the confidence drain, just slightly, out of three very expensive faces, because they suddenly did not know how much I knew. Then Frances opened the envelope. She laid the evaluator's session file on the table, one page at a time, the way you deal cards. The intake record showing the child was brought in by the grandmother, the consent form signed by one parent, without the other's knowledge, and then the session notes, the evaluator's own contemporaneous notes, and Frances read the substance of them into the record in her calm, even voice. That the grandmother had been present during the child's interview, that the child had stated, repeatedly, that she was not afraid at her mother's home, and was not left alone, that the grandmother had, on multiple occasions, prompted the child and pressed her to reconsider her answers. The courtroom had gone very quiet. So the anxiety related to the maternal home environment, cited in the summary letter, Frances said, was, according to the evaluator's own notes, a child's distress at being pressured by her grandmother to say something the child knew was untrue. And then Frances read the last note, the one where the evaluator had documented Colette's own words about the family's true objective, that they simply needed enough on paper to move custody, because the Ashford granddaughter belonged with the Ashfords, and a mother who moved from base to base was never going to be allowed to raise her. The silence after that was total. I could hear the building's ventilation, a soft rush somewhere overhead. Behind the Ashford table, I watched Grant turn to look at his mother, and I watched something break open on his face. I think, in that moment, he understood for the first time what his family had actually done, and what he had let them do in his name. Colette had gone the color of paper. And the three lawyers, the wall of charcoal suits, sat very still, because there is no cross-examination in the world that repairs a client's own documented confession. Frances turned to the judge, and she still had not raised her voice. Your Honor, the petitioners have asked this court to remove a child from her mother on grounds of instability and neglect. But the central evidence supporting that claim was, by the evaluator's own records, obtained without the custodial parent's knowledge or consent, in the presence of an interested party who coached the child, in service of a stated goal that had nothing to do with the child's welfare and everything to do with a family's belief that they were entitled to her. I would ask the court to consider not whether Captain Bennett is a fit mother, the evidence on that is overwhelming and undisputed, but why a family would go to these lengths, and spend this much, to take a devoted mother's daughter from her. The lead attorney rose and asked for a recess. His voice had lost every trace of its polish. I won't dramatize the rest, because the truth was more powerful than any drama. Once the evaluator's file was in the record, the case didn't just weaken, it inverted. The judge did not remove Maddie from me. She did the opposite. She found the petition was not brought in the child's best interest, but for an improper purpose, and she ordered the tainted evaluation stricken entirely. She left primary custody with me. She sharply restricted the grandmother's unsupervised contact, and she had words for Colette Ashford, about using a child as an instrument, about the real harm done to a 7-year-old who was pressured to lie about the mother she loved, that I will remember for the rest of my life. She noted, for the record, that in 30 years on the bench, she had rarely seen a clearer attempt to weaponize wealth against a fit parent. It was never about winning against Grant, or punishing Colette. Frances made that clear early, and by the end I believed her completely. It was about keeping my daughter safe from people who had already shown they would use her as a tool, and about making sure that the next time Maddie told the truth, telling the truth would be the thing that protected her, not the thing that got her pressured in a stranger's office. Colette Ashford never apologized. I heard later, through Grant, that she maintained to the end that she'd only wanted what was best for Maddie. I found I didn't need her apology, and didn't want it. She wasn't my battle anymore. The court had settled that. Grant surprised me. A few weeks after the hearing, he asked to meet, and he sat across from me at a coffee shop, and he cried, and he said he hadn't known the half of what his mother had done, that he'd let himself be carried along because it was easier than standing up to her, and that he was ashamed. I didn't forgive him all at once. Trust doesn't come back that fast. But he began showing up differently after that. On time, present, his own man for maybe the first time in his life. And slowly, for Maddie's sake, we built something that actually worked. Life settled. I finished my rotation and came home. And the first thing Maddie did was tackle me at the door and refuse to let go for a full minute. And I stood in my own doorway holding my daughter and understood exactly what I'd fought for. Kate stayed close. She and Maddie had forged a bond during those weeks that never faded. My career kept moving. The very career they'd tried to use as proof I couldn't be a mother became, in time, the thing that let me give Maddie a good life. People ask me sometimes how I won a custody case against 3 lawyers and a fortune, with a single envelope. And I tell them the truth. I didn't win it in that courtroom. I won it 11 weeks earlier, at a swimming pool, when a 7-year-old in pink goggles decided to tell her mother the truth about a secret she'd been told to keep. Everything after that was just documentation. So if there's one thing I'd want you to carry out of my story, it's this. Never ever underestimate the child in the room. They see more than we think. They understand more than we credit them for. And when a child tells you what they saw, plainly, without being asked, with that serious little face, believe them, and thank them, and make very sure they always know that telling the truth is safe with you. Because the people who tried to take my daughter counted on a little girl staying quiet. And the whole thing came apart because she didn't. And the second thing, the one I'd tack up on every wall if I could. When someone comes at you with overwhelming force, the lawyers, the money, the mountain of paper, the confident story, do not mistake that force for the truth. Intimidation is what people reach for when the facts aren't on their side. Stay calm, gather the small things, and when the moment comes, let the truth speak plainly, because the truth has never once needed to shout. I walked in alone, with one envelope. It was enough. It's almost always enough, if what's inside it is true. Thank you for spending this time with me. If Nora's story reached something you've lived through, or reminded you of a child in your life who sees far more than anyone realizes, I'd be honored if you shared it. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever been underestimated by people who were certain they'd already won? And if you'd like to hear more stories about quiet strength, hard-won truth, and the fierce, unbreakable love between a parent and a child, I hope you'll subscribe and join me again. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people who've truly earned a place in your life.